Over 11,000 years ago, in what is today southeastern Anatolia, people came together to make this, Göbekli Tepe. The site is best known for its massive T-shaped columns, many of which are richly decorated. Little did the people making this site know that thousands of years later, no other archaeological site in the world would be as hotly debated. And unfortunately lost amongst this discussion is actually all of the archaeological research that has gone into our knowledge of this site, when it was built and who built it. And it's this last point that I want to focus on, because again and again you will see one type of comment pop up. How did primitive hunter-gatherers build this site? So today, let's dig deeper into the archaeological research and finally put to bed once and for all the question, did hunter-gatherers really build Göbekli Tepe? Hi, my name's Hugh Thomas. I have a PhD in archaeology and I'm a lecturer in archaeology at a major university. I also have over 20 years field experience all across the world. Now, if you're watching this, you might have already got a good idea about the archaeology of Göbekli Tepe, but if you don't, here's a really basic summary. Göbekli Tepe is from a period called the pre-pottery Neolithic, which means basically what it says, that ceramics or pottery hadn't been invented yet. The earliest dates suggest the site was created around the middle of the 10th millennium, which means about 12,000 to 11,000 years ago. The site itself is known primarily for a series of special buildings, these huge structures which are partially composed of these large T-shaped pillars, which are covered in all manner of images of wild animals and some symbols. Now, these pillars take up a lot of attention and they're the primary focus of the whole hunter-gatherers couldn't build this group. So as I'll show you later on in this video, we have tons of examples of modern indigenous tribes around the world making similar pillars. Smaller rectangular structures are located around these special buildings. Now, these could be residential structures, but further work is ongoing. And in fact, I think at the moment I'm filming this, they are digging them up right now. So in order to answer the question, was Göbekli Tepe built by hunter-gatherers, we first need to understand what is a hunter-gatherer. The problem is that today, not a huge amount of people understand what a hunter-gatherer actually is. The term hunter-gatherer carries a lot of baggage. You'll often see it associated with the word primitive, which archaeologists don't use. I've even seen someone call them berry eaters before. Unfortunately, a lot of this misinformation stems from people like anthropologists 150 years ago, not really understanding hunter-gatherer societies or trying to compare them to sort of modern European lifestyles at the time. Take, for example, John Lubbock. Now, Lubbock did a lot for archaeology. For example, he invented the words Paleolithic and Neolithic. He created the foundations of heritage laws protecting archaeological sites. But he also said stuff like this. Neither free nor noble, he is a slave to his own wants, his own passions, imperfectly protected from the weather. He suffers from the cold by night and the heat of the sun by day. Hunger always stares him in the face and often drives him to the dreadful alternative of cannibalism or death. And the problem is that many of these early ideas of how hunter-gatherers lived, that they're struggling on the brink of death, is still what a lot of the general public today think a hunter-gatherer is. So let's get into it. What is a hunter-gatherer? At its simplest, a hunter-gatherer is effectively a person or a group of people who obtain their food through hunting and gathering. That's it. The term hunter-gatherer doesn't tell us anything about their technology, their social hierarchy, or even whether they were living in one spot or not. It's really just a term about what they're eating. If you live in New York City, you could walk into Central Park, you could capture, kill, and eat a pigeon and grab a few walnuts or berries from a tree, and hey presto, you're a hunter-gatherer. Because although the term hunter-gatherer can be applied to a whole bunch of groups all around the world because they all get their food from hunting and gathering, the reality is that they're all wildly different. And how do we know this? Ethnography. Ethnography is effectively the collection of data about how people live. And the idea behind it is that if we can look at modern hunter-gatherers today, and yes, hunter-gatherer groups still exist, we can use that information to understand about people in the past, including at Göbekli Tepe. Now, if you're interested in hunter-gatherers and ethnographic studies of them, I would highly recommend this book. Now, I should acknowledge that the book is at pains to point out that some of the examples they use are groups who do things like grow their own food or trade for food or participate in cash economies. That is, they're not pure hunter-gatherers. But the goal of this book is not to look just at pure hunter-gatherers, but also aspects of hunter-gatherer lifestyles that are used by people today. The book does a few different things. It does get quite technical and even breaks down the mathematics of hunter-gathering, creating mathematical equations on decision-making processes behind how hunter-gatherer groups live on the landscape. It also shows really simple data collected about hunter-gatherer groups. This table, for example, looks at how many hours modern hunter-gatherers dedicate to foraging for both men and women. But it also provides real-world examples of hunter-gatherer practices that to me are just mind-blowing. The Nunavut tribe in Alaska have an in-depth knowledge of landscapes up to 250,000 square kilometers, which is basically the size of Colorado, and that's even if they haven't actually gone and visited these spots. The Jutwasi people not only make bows by constantly heat cycling them at specific temperatures, they have learned to make poison arrows from the pupal stage of a specific type of beetle. You might be saying, Hugh, okay, this is amazing, but it's not moving 10-ton stones amazing, except we have ethnographic examples of stones either of the same size or bigger than those at Göbekli Tepe being moved with only natural materials like wood. We have photos of the Nayas culture from the last 100 years moving big stones through dense forest using only natural materials. And we also have other modern examples of people moving massive columns using only natural materials. If you're interested in how people move big things, that is going to be the focus of a video of mine in the not too distant future. So now we know what a hunter-gatherer is. The question is, was Göbekli Tepe built by hunter-gatherers? And in order to work that out, we really only need to work out two things. Were they hunting and were they gathering? Read any publication about Göbekli Tepe, and trust me, there are lots of them. So I'll put a few links to some choice articles below in the description. You'll often see the discussion about how many faunal remains have been found at the site. Faunal remains effectively means animal bones. There are masses of them. But if you look at the publications, or indeed this table here, you might notice that there is a real prevalence of gazelle bones. Based off the faunal remains, we know that the site of Göbekli Tepe is being lived at during this period where there are a lot of gazelle in the area. Archaeologists at Göbekli Tepe have also found a lot of stone tools that are related to hunting, things like arrowheads, for example. So we know that hunting was a major part of their lifestyle. There is one crucial thing missing from this faunal assemblage: domesticated animal remains. In order to understand whether the bones you have are from a domesticated animal, you have to look at it in a bunch of different ways. One of those ways is called morphometrics. As humans begin to domesticate animals, they change in shape and size. Morphometrics is where you statistically analyze things like the form and the size of bones. If you have these stats for both wild animals and domesticated animals, you can begin to identify bones that may be from a domesticated animal. Now, a really good example of this, and probably it at its most extreme, is dogs. Look at the bones of a wild wolf versus, say, a chihuahua, and you can obviously see the difference. It's why archaeozoologists, and I love them, but when you're driving in the middle of the desert and they see a skeleton of a wild animal on the side of the pathway, you will always be asked to stop so they can collect samples or take measurements. Now, obviously, you can also use things like DNA, but DNA doesn't regularly preserve well in really ancient environments or in arid environments, and also it can cost quite a lot of money. So you might reserve that for when you have more suitable types of bones, like petrous bones. Another cool emerging technique is called zooms, and that I'm going to talk about in another video, but I encourage you to go and read all about it. Ultimately, the faunal assemblage so far indicates that there were no domesticated animals at Göbekli Tepe. But if they found it, wow, because it would completely change our understanding of when animals were domesticated and also change our interpretation of the site. So we've ticked off the hunting part of things. Now let's turn our attention to gathering. So how do archaeologists identify the plants that people might have been eating in antiquity? Well, there are a few different ways we go about it. The easiest thing is when you find a little hearth or fireplace and you get to look at the carbonized seeds and wood that were present inside of it. But if you don't have that, what do? Well, this is where you start relying on a technique called flotation. Now, when archaeologists are digging, we don't just, dig up the sediment, throw it in a bucket and then toss it away. I mean, we're tossing away pay dirt effectively. Yeah? The first thing you do with your bucket is you go and pour it into a sieve. Shake it around, get rid of all the sediment, and what you're hoping to find is things like artifacts, or if you're really lucky, seeds. Now, if you don't find it there, you then go on to flotation. Pour the sediment into this large contraption that has water flowing through it. As the water runs all over this and gets rid of the sediment, the heavier stuff sinks to the bottom and the lighter stuff will float to the top, including organic material. things like seeds and charcoal. The heavy stuff which sinks to the bottom is called heavy residue or heavy res. And if you go on any project that does archaeological flotation, there's always fields of heavy res drying out in the sun, or students and staff laboriously, sweeping through the heavy res trying to find really tiny artifacts. Now, the problem with Göbekli Tepe is that for whatever reason, the botanical remains don't survive very well. So the question is, what do you do now? How do you prove what plants people were eating? So if you don't find a lot of botanical remains during excavation or flotation, how do you tell what plants people were eating or using? Well, let me introduce you to the wonderful world of phytoliths. Basically, as the plants grow, they suck up water and also silica, and that goes into the plant, solidifies, and basically replicates the structure of the cells of the plant. Effectively, you can kind of think of them as like little tiny plant skeletons. And the good thing about them is that long after the plant disappears and decomposes, the phytoliths remain. So phytoliths are incredibly small. They're less than the size of a human hair. So apart from doing things like sieving and flotation that I mentioned before, you can also take samples of sediment to look for phytoliths. But if you happen to have an artifact that you know was likely to have been used for food production, you can also sort of scrape off those and test that for phytoliths. So enter the grindstones. Göbekli Tepe has a lot of stones related to the grinding of food. This 2019 paper by the Göbekli Tepe team documents their analysis of these grindstones. You can see they have a mixture of stones used for both grinding up material, bowls or querns for example, that hold the plant remains, or even things like meat, and then you grind them with grindstones or pestles. There are lots of different shapes and sizes of these stones. In the paper, they analysed more than 7,000 artifacts, and they did things including making 3D models of the stones, creating replicas for experimental archaeology, and you can actually go and watch the videos of them doing this experimental archaeology, but also testing both the sediment and the stones themselves for phytoliths. Now, there are lots of protocols about how you measure phytoliths, and these are all listed in the article. And you know what else is listed there? All of the raw data. You can go and check it out yourself. But basically, they found lots of wild grasses, einkorn, barley, almonds, pistachio, all of them so far identified as wild species. Now, how do you determine if a phytolith is from a domesticated plant or a wild plant? Well, it's the same thing as meat. Yep, morphometrics. We think they made things like porridges and maybe also some sort of form of bread. So go back, around 11,000 years and you got yourself a pretty cool party happening at Göbekli Tepe. You got some nice gazelle steaks, you got yourself some, fruit and veg, you got yourself maybe some bread or some porridge. But there's one other thing you need to really make this a great party. Beer. That's really good. It's a hazy pale ale. I don't think they had that 11,000 years ago, but This is not some kind of paid promotion, by the way. I won this case at a charity auction at my kid's school. So here's the thing. There is some tentative evidence that at Göbekli Tepe, they had beer. So some large storage vats have been found in some of the structures. These may have been used for beer. Now, it probably wasn't a hazy pale ale, it's more likely some kind of like a warm British lager that you get on a tap. The thing about Göbekli Tepe is that the things like grindstones or the faunal remains are massive. There are huge quantities of them, much more than they find at more typical domestic sites. Now, you've had a big night at Göbekli Tepe. You've had a few beers, you've had some steaks, and you wake up in the morning and you're not feeling particularly great. Well, the thing that we all crave in the morning after a few cold beers is obviously a nice big glass of water. Now, that poses an interesting problem at Göbekli Tepe because, well, there isn't natural water sources very close by. The closest stream or river is about several kilometers away, so it would have meant that you had a pretty big walk to get water. How did the people at Göbekli Tepe get water? Well, that question might have got answered a few years ago during the preparation for the construction of this. Two large parts of the site of Göbekli Tepe are covered by these roof structures. Now, they do two things. The first is they protect the archaeological remains, and the second is they create a nice, safe walkway for tourists like you and me to go and visit the site and to not only see the archaeology, but also watch the archaeologists excavating. And yes, they are excavating. Now, prior to the construction of this, they needed to work out where they could put the structural supports, the legs of the structure, and that had to be attached or go into the bedrock. But obviously, you've got a lot of archaeology there, so you kind of need to know where you're going to put these. And in order to work that out, they used a series of things called test trenches. So let's delve into trenches in archaeology. At its most basic, a trench is just a rectangular or a square space in which archaeologists excavate. Most people think of trenches as a growing patchwork of squares. You excavate one trench down, you find some kind of amazing site, and you slowly build off that. And that's because for a lot of larger sites, like Göbekli Tepe, this is kind of how the trenches naturally expand. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes you might put a trench within a trench. This is called a sondage, for example. You can also create things called test trenches, which are maybe not designed to sort of open up a large area, but are instead created for a variety of different reasons. But there are a lot of reasons why you might put a test trench in. You could put it towards the edge of the site in order to work out where the boundary of that site might be. But you can also chuck a few down if you just want basic information, like how deep does the site go? Does it sit on a natural soil profile or is it on bedrock? You know, there are lots of different reasons for a test trench to be created. Or in this case, they placed test trenches down in order to work out if there was any important archaeological remains that needed to be avoided when they put the pylons in for the structure. But the second thing is that it gives archaeological information about what is present in that area. Now, they found a bunch of really cool things in these test trenches. Some of the test trenches were expanded or extended because they just couldn't put the structural supports there. They changed the location of some of the structural supports. And you can read about all of these things in the reports that the team put out. But it was at the base of one of these test trenches for the structural supports where they found something really interesting. A channel carved into bedrock. Now, that might not sound exciting, but what they theorize is that this was a water channel that they was using to direct water from the site down into probably some form of storage pit, like a cistern. So obviously one of the big questions is, did they live there permanently? Now we can look at a few different types of ethnographic examples to maybe try and theorize how people were living at this site. Obviously with Göbekli Tepe being so big and with so much archaeological evidence in terms of grindstones and faunal remains, the question was whether people were living there permanently. The gazelle bones that have been found there suggest that people were there at least between midsummer to autumn. But could they have been there longer? Do hunter-gatherers even stay in one spot for a long period of time? Well, ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities tell us that hunter-gatherers do sometimes live in places for a long time. The Batak people of the Philippines have a central settlement that basically is permanently occupied from anywhere from like 7 to 10 years, whilst families spend about 25% of the year in the settlement and then go out into field houses and camps. Hunter-gatherers living at Point Barrow in Alaska live in settlements, only heading out during the summer months to sort of hunt and live in camps, returning to the more permanent settlements during winter. So it is possible that people lived at Göbekli Tepe all year round with seasonal swelling. But how did they amass so many people that they were able to spend time erecting things like T-pillars and special buildings? Even the archaeologists working there have suggested that a workforce of hundreds may have been needed for this. Well, it may have been that people came to help specifically for one thing: the barbecues. In West Sumba, they still use megalithic stones to honor ancestral spirits, and they also move them with natural materials, like wooden sleds lashed with vines. Now, the stone present in this media article was actually larger than most of those found at Göbekli Tepe. It's about 35 tons. And they were also moving it 2 kilometers from the quarry to the site, whereas at Göbekli Tepe, they were only moving them anywhere from maybe 100 to 500 meters. And we know this because they've found unfinished T-pillars in the quarry. So in West Sumba, how do they get workers to move the stone? Well, food. Not only are people fed whilst they're moving the stone, but they also have a huge feast once they arrive. And this could be the exact modern parallel for how Göbekli Tepe secured the labor force to create these massive structures. Oh, and if you want, you can watch a video of people from Sumba moving massive stones using the traditional techniques. I mean, look at this. Look at how fast they can pull this thing. But be warned, they have a feast at the end of this video, which involves them slaughtering animals, and it gets pretty graphic. Now, the archaeologist in me looks at all the research that the team from Göbekli Tepe is putting out in terms of, phytoliths and grindstones and meat production and isotopes about where the gazelle are moving across the landscape and thinks like, wow, this stuff is super cool. Like, this is my jam, right? But I also recognize that I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and a paper about gazelle isotopes aren't necessarily going to, bring the crowds back into archaeology. In the end, I get it. T-pillars are cool and they capture our imagination. It can be so fun to look at these images on the stone and try and determine why someone might have carved that scene over 10,000 years ago. But this doesn't mean anything unless you understand about the people who lived at the site. These people can't tell us in their own words why they were there, how long they stayed, or even when they stayed. But the archaeological remains themselves give us this insight. So without things like ethnography and phytoliths, archaeozoologists, morphometrics, flotation, and everything else in between, we wouldn't know that Göbekli Tepe was made by hunter-gatherers. We wouldn't know about them eating gazelle or having alcohol, or that they were possibly living there for long periods of time. We wouldn't know anything about this. And as I showed, the analysis of this data is really technical. Even I look at the papers on isotopes or phytoliths, and I can be confused, and this is my job. These fields are highly specialized. They take time, and not a huge amount of people do it. There are very few 5-year-old children who go up to their parents and say, "Mummy, Daddy, I want to look at morphometrics when I grow up." So to summarize, yes, Göbekli Tepe was created by hunter-gatherers, and we can see exactly what they were eating and drinking. And yes, Göbekli Tepe demonstrates to us just how complicated, artistic, technical, amazing the lives of hunter-gatherers could be, and still are today. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about hunter-gatherers and Göbekli Tepe. If you've enjoyed this video, I really encourage you to like, subscribe, ring the little bell thing, whatever you would need to do in order to see my content in the future. If you have any suggestions for videos you'd like me to produce in the future, please let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers.